I'm Walter Isaacson. I'm president of the Aspen Institute. It's great for all of us here to be in partnership with Bloomberg TV and to continue this wonderful Aspen in New York program. I want to thank Judy Samuelson, Linda Ware, Elliot Gerson, all the people who put it together for the Aspen Institute. This is part of Aspen Institute's plan to have a somewhat larger presence in New York, on the theory that Aspen's not pretty enough and we want to see these beautiful views of New York like this crystal clear, beautiful morning showed us. I hope you enjoyed last night, and I really don't want to take up much more of your time except for to say that the Business and Society program run by Judy Samuelson is one of the oldest at the Aspen Institute. It's more than 11 years old. It has been doing great work. You might not know it from looking at the American economy, but the parts of it that have been saved by the salvation and grace of the Business and Society program of the Aspen Institute. So I would like you to become more involved with that. It is based here in New York, so you can talk to Judy and become more involved if you want. And now it's my great pleasure to introduce Pim Fox of Bloomberg Television, Bloomberg Radio, and Bloomberg News. He names everything after himself.
Everything. Yeah, well, it's a brand. It's a brand. Thank you very much, Walter. I'd like to welcome the participants of the Aspen Group to Bloomberg World Headquarters here in New York. And, really, what better place and what better time to investigate capitalism and the future, right? Capitalism and the future. That's the title of today's event. As Walter said, I'm Pim Fox. I'm the host of Taking Stock on Bloomberg, where I try to provide context for each guest and each topic. So I thought, what about the context for capitalism and the future today? I'm on nice November morning, 2009. So let me give you some context, right, from Bloomberg News. Ken Lewis, Raj Rajaratnam, Bernie Madoff, Lehman Brothers, Bear Stearns. And that's what, just in the last 24 months. So it seems to me that you've got some serious work to do today, and I applaud you for it. The stakes are high in, maybe this is a post-Wall Street world. And yes, we know that there are already libraries full of histories about how we got here. I think that history is still being written right here, right now. So good luck today. Have some fun. And with that, it is my pleasure and my privilege to introduce Judith Samuelson of the Aspen Institute for all of the effort and dedication at this event. Thank you.
Good morning. Welcome. It's truly a delight to be here. I feel, how many of you were there last night at the event at the Public Library? I feel like we just skipped, 4 centuries, moving from that stunning venue to this one, which feels much more at home to me today in the 21st century. Bloomberg has been a terrific partner throughout this process, and we're delighted to be here at last and to present, I think, today an array of very interesting lenses on capitalism. We're going to have a panel. We're doing 2 panels this morning, 2 this afternoon, interspersed with an interview at lunchtime. You all have the program in front of you and bios inside the goodie bag. If you want to dig in there, you'll find the bios of the panelists today. We're going to look at this from different vantage points. The second panel this morning is going to be looking at capital markets. We've titled it Slow Capital with a note to the slow food movement. Somebody said slow capital is dumb capital. That's a very bad title. We'll test some of those propositions today and think about it from the vantage point of capital markets. This afternoon we're going to be talking about values. Can you actually sustain values in business, and end up talking about some of these tensions, Wall Street, Main Street, and Washington. But this morning we're starting off with a panel which I think is the one I'm most excited about in many ways because I think it's a great way to begin our conversation. And the conversation we have this morning is whether or not we can really innovate from within business. Is business, with its tremendous talent-rich, problem-solving, resource-abundant, globe-trotting, remarkable distribution systems, can we employ those to address our most complex problems in a way that enhances not only the business environment, which is so critical to our long-term success, but also the wider society, which embraces hosts and is very much a partner here. The Business and Society program is, if I were to say very quickly what it's about aligning business with the long-term health of the commons. And so we're delighted this morning to have in our first panel 2 companies. I can say without trying to give you too much more detail that I used both of their products this morning. I will leave that to your imagination. But we also are graced with the presence of a very important firm, IDEO, that is an innovator in itself in terms of working with businesses and identifying the opportunities for social innovation within. So as a panel, please join me up here. If you please take your seats. And it is my pleasure, first of all, to introduce Michael Waldholtz, journalist, author. He's been part of Bloomberg News since June 2005 as a senior editor, named managing editor that December. And he oversees all of Bloomberg's health and science staff of 36 reporters and editors in bureaus in the US, Europe, and Asia. He's got a very long experience in other media, including the Wall Street Journal, and has been deeply involved in public health issues, among others, and so it is our great delight to have him this morning lead us off.
Okay. Well, thank you, Jude. And I'd like to second Pam in welcoming all of you to Bloomberg's World Headquarters. It's a real pleasure to be working here and to be able to host this event. As was noted, today's panel, the first panel of the day, is titled Building a Better World. Can business innovation benefit society and the environment? This is a topic that's been very close to my heart for almost my entire career as a journalist. So I'm hoping that the conversation today will illuminate for all of us and as well as be provocative. I'd like to introduce the other members of the panel, and then I'm going to make some very brief comments of my own so we can get into what we're hoping to be a lively conversation. To my left and your right is Fred Dust, who is a partner at IDEO, which is the very well-known global design consultancy, and he leads the environmental design group, helping clients with strategic and innovation goals around space, real estate, and communities. The work puts multidisciplinary teams into the field to translate consumer insight into unique design experiences in areas such as healthcare, education, retail, housing, urban planning, community development. Quite impressive. To Fred's left is Pamela Passman, who leads Microsoft's global corporate affairs function, which oversees 4 main missions, providing regulatory counsel to business groups on public policy issues, strengthening government and industry relations, developing partnerships with governments, international organizations, and community and philanthropic investment. She also has leadership responsibility for Microsoft's corporate citizenship efforts and Microsoft's Unlimited Potential, which is a commitment to bring the benefits of technology to the next 5 billion people. And to her left is, of course, Jeff Hollander, who is the founder and executive chairperson of Seventh Generation, who makes all those nifty, environmentally friendly household products that many of us use. And it's as a leading, I've been told, the leading and fastest growing brand of natural products and a leading authority on issues related to making positive difference in the health of the planet. So welcome to all of you. It's a real pleasure to be here on a panel with you. I just wanted to say in my brief welcoming remarks, and then I'm going to be asking the panel a few questions. And interspersing that with questions from the audience. At a certain point, I'll say I'd like some questions. Hopefully, you'll just raise your hand. I think that's the way we'll handle it and try to keep it as lively as possible. But as I said, this morning's panel is being asked to tackle a very thorny question at the root of whether capitalism, as the driving force for American life and much of the world, can be unleashed or harnessed to solve the greatest challenges facing the planet. These, of course, include, but are not limited to, global warming, access to finite resources such as energy and water and food, and also an increasing issue, but one not often included in this previous list: how can we make the workplace and work itself both sustaining and fulfilling for those of us in the developed nations as well as those who are beginning to enter it? As was noted in the introduction, I covered global health issues and science for almost 25 years at the Wall Street Journal, and now I'm doing the same, or at least overseeing those same issues here at Bloomberg News. Among my interests has been telling the evolving and often, to me, thrilling story of how science and science-based industries, most particularly the pharmaceutical and biotech industries, have been the force for innovation in both this country and the rest of the world. I think only the digital revolution can be given as much credit as changing the lives of people as has had the effect of the biopharmaceutical industry in the last few decades. Others can discuss the role of the internet and computing better than I can, but I've spent, as I said, my professional life documenting how capitalism can be the fuel behind breakthroughs that have transformed medicine. One of the stories that I covered in the early to mid 1990s was the remarkable development of drugs to treat AIDS. Beginning with the terrible epidemic's rise in the early 80s until around 1995, people in the developed world in the West, as well as folks in the developing world in Asia and Africa who were being besieged by HIV and AIDS, were pretty much on an even basis. There were no treatments. There was no vaccine. There still isn't any. But when, in fact, drugs became available, first in 1995, and then in 1996, this combination of therapies which really transformed the treatment, has made AIDS a manageable disease in places where the drugs are accessible. The balance between the haves and have-nots was quite remarkable, because the first treatments were about $15,000 a year, and we were talking about people, 30 million people in Africa, for instance, who were infected and whose average per capita income in these countries was less than a few $100s a year. Of course, as a journalist, one of the most thrilling stories for me was to write about how academia literally dissected the AIDS virus within a few years and identified the genes that drive the virus, that make it replicate. But it was really the pharmaceutical industry, the geniuses in those industries, who figured out ways of creating chemicals, in fact small pills, that could actually block the activity of the genes crucial to the life cycle of the virus. Again, when that happened, there was a revolution in the treatment of the disease. Now, you can walk through, AIDS is not necessarily the best example, but the revolution in treating heart disease with cholesterol-lowering drugs, diabetes, high blood pressure, you could say mental health disorders, depression, schizophrenia, have all come out of this combination between academia, and in this country, academia that has mostly been funded by the federal government through the National Institutes of Health and its granting program, and then handed over to companies, or companies themselves took control of it to exploit this technology. The driving force, of course, for all these companies has always been profits. But the quest for profits often collides with this crusade to transform what clearly has been a golden age of biology into modern miracles. One need look no further than the global credit meltdown for examples of companies that turned a good, for instance, home ownership for the low income, into the horrific. In the drug industry, we've seen the zeal for profits, the often single-minded focus of meeting Wall Street's insatiable quarter-to-quarter growth, turn otherwise well-meaning folks, and I've reported on many of these, into criminals, marketing medicines for either unproven uses and sometimes literally bribing doctors to use or excessively use drugs in ways that they probably shouldn't have been. So today I'd like to, without getting too much further into that topic, I'd like to turn to the panel and see if we can address with specific examples whether a new business ethos and a new set of goals can or even should be expected from business. Maybe we can find out if that is already happening in an evolutionary way that can be spurred by government incentives. In the end, the pharmaceutical industry, after many years of digging in its heels, figured out a way of lowering prices of the drugs in a sort of a tiered fashion that they had never done before. And in fact, literally giving up their profits to companies in India and Africa, generic-making companies, whose lower cost basis allowed them to sell the drugs at a lower price. The motivation for them was certainly not profits, it was something else. And you know, that probably would take an entire book, although how interesting it would be, I don't know, to explain how that happened. But again, it's a model that I feel I understood, but I'm hoping to turn to the rest of the panel for others. So, Fred, I was thinking of turning to you first to sort of, to you first. I'm sorry. I was looking at him and call him Fred. But I meant to turn to you first, and because you are involved in so many different companies and providing this kind of consulting, you know, is what I'm talking about something that is possible for capitalism? Is it something that requires some sort of societal changes that are conscious or unconscious, activity by government, some sort of partnership between?
Yeah, no, I mean, actually, I mean, I think we're seeing it everywhere. And I think the reality is that I think increasingly what we're seeing is that it's actually a mandate. These things have to be. It has to be kind of part and parcel. It's the only way we're going to make the changes we have. I thought actually, for those of you who were there last night, it's amazing any panelist is here after having watched the events of last night. I barely slept, but I thought Indra actually made a really interesting and kind of fascinating comment when she talked about the expansion of her notion of what shareholder was for her, and that shareholder didn't necessarily mean that these are people who were going to directly profit from the company, but were in fact also the people who work for the company, the people who actually are the consumers of the company. And I think that expanded notion of shareholder is a critical mind shift for us, but I think we're seeing it. And I think that's actually what's ultimately going to lead to the innovations that are going to impact not just shareholders and not just consumers, but the people who are exposed to the infrastructures that the companies create. I'm certain that that's something you see and believe as well.
Absolutely.
Okay, good. Thank you. Pamela, would you like to comment on that?
I think the information technology industry has really been based on this objective of being sure to be able to disseminate technology broadly throughout society. I know our company was based on this idea of a platform, that we would build a platform and then provide tools and resources and training to other software developers and others to be able to build on that platform and to innovate in ways that we cannot possibly imagine. So innovation has been core to who we are as a company, and really I think the information technology more broadly. And when we think about the future and the big challenges that we have, we think that information technology will actually play a very significant role in enabling, whether it's health, education, energy efficiency. I mean, the one thing that our industry is very focused on is driving technology deeper into the economic pyramid. And so we have been in the last few years really rethinking. I mean, we build technology for really the top of the pyramid, and we disseminate that in 150 countries around the world. So in some countries, a great deal of the population benefits from that technology, but in some, it's really just the very high economic part of the pyramid. So we and others have been very focused on trying to come up with new technology that better addresses the needs at the base of the pyramid.
I guess I'll take a somewhat different cut at this. It's probably risky asking someone who sells toilet paper about innovation, but
it was at one point.
It was. It's gotten softer. But I probably, might not be alive if it wasn't for a lot of the innovation in medical technology and all of the wonderful innovations that our society has created. Yet at the same time, I am fundamentally concerned and disturbed that the system within which we are operating has some fundamental flaws. And many people would look at Seventh Generation and say, you know, what a great company doing all these wonderful things. And yet, as I reflect on what we have accomplished, you know, at the end of the day, I have to come to the conclusion that we are less bad than other companies. I can't say that we are good. We don't leave the world in a better place than it was before we got here. We consume resources, we emit CO2, we create garbage, and for me, the challenge is how do you actually, as a business, be a force for good rather than a force for less bad? And I think that I struggle with Indira talking about the good things that she's doing, because they're good and we need more of them. But even if they all come to fruition, what kind of world will we have? And I think that for me, I worry that we're talking about the passing of this disaster and this crisis without taking the opportunity to make the fundamental changes we have to make. And if I was to talk about the single, perhaps most important thing that needs to happen that will change innovation, is that as long as companies like Seventh Generation and Pepsi are allowed to externalize their costs onto society, we will end up with solutions that are not beneficial for most and for the planet. And thus, cap and trade is a small piece of a larger issue. And if we begin to change the rules so that Pepsi pays the costs and the healthcare costs of people who end up being obese because they drink too much soda, even if they do spend time watching a lot of TV, they wouldn't sell that kind of product. And thus, to me, you know, and you could say this, the whole debate about how involved business and government should be is an interesting question. I don't think we're going to get to where we have to go depending upon the goodwill of business, because I think business has a purpose that is not often aligned with what is best for society.
Well, and I think that's core to what we're discussing today. I was thinking about a news story that we reported in the health group yesterday, along the lines of what you were saying, that had a deep irony that I'm not sure the company that we reported about appreciated. It was about Johnson & Johnson, which I'm not in any way denigrating. Great products, terrific company, but announcing that it was cutting back 6 or 7% of its global workforce of over 100,000 people. And the chairman, CEO, said the reason was because they have numerous consumer products and there are so many people unemployed, they're not buying the product, so he's going to fire more people. And we sort of scratched our head and said, well, how does that mesh? And there's not room in our particular kind of journalism for a blog-like snotty response, but it certainly called for one. So just to state...
and that's contrary. If you go and read James Burke, who was the president and CEO of Johnson & Johnson, he actually listed shareholders third. He said, we have to serve our customers first, we have to serve our employees second, and we have to serve our shareholders third. And that was a visionary statement, you know, 20, 30 years ago. It's a shame that the first thing companies do, and I think, you know, I wouldn't pick out Johnson & Johnson. What do they do when you're not meeting your quarterly earnings? Is you fire people. You know, this great human resource that we say is such a wonderful thing is the first thing to go when we can't meet our quarterly earnings targets. And to me, that's a systemic problem. And it makes all of the other problems worse. I mean, they'll have less employees that can even buy their own products after they fire 10,000 people.
Or to have health insurance to be, as you say, to have it reimbursed. You know, Pamela, just, you know, you do, as part of your role, I understand you have a government relations. do we, as a people, in this country in particular, I mean, I was mentioning this to you before the panel, that we're not only talking about capitalism driving innovation, but the other side of the issue that makes it so difficult in this country is that we're a wonderful democracy. And as much as we'd like to, we don't have a command and control economy. We've been reporting it's a drop in the bucket to a certain extent, but China is attempting in a very aggressive way to deal with its energy issues, particularly the carbon emissions issues, because it can make to a limited extent, certain kinds of demands on people that we just don't do in this country. Do we need, what's a practical solution? Aside from having a panel,
Well, I mean, fundamentally, business is to drive innovations in products and services that people need, and to do it in a way that generates jobs and economic activity that advances broader economic growth and opportunity and societal advancement. To do that in a way that provides broader benefits across what we call, we have a business ecosystem. We're a software company, but we rely on lots of other hardware companies, other software companies, other services companies. And so we have to design our business so that we're successful, but that they're also successful. And then we also think about our customers and how can we deliver to them, low-cost products. Well, we need to do that at a high volume. And then we think about the broader communities. There are people and organizations and communities who don't have the ability to purchase our products. So how do we enable them, whether it's a low cost or it's a donation? So we think about various aspects of our footprint and our impact on society. But fundamentally, as a business, we're focused on innovating and driving forward the information technology sector and its ability to have an impact on every sector of the economy. And we get feedback. We get lots of feedback. We get feedback from partners. We get feedback from customers. We get feedback from government. And we have to assimilate all of that and then think about, fundamentally, our ability to drive forward the information technology industry, because it has such an incredible impact on every sector of the economy.
I actually might just add, I think that it's interesting when you get into conversations of innovation, and you I think I see it here as well, like we tend to fall into the notion that innovation is around technological advancement or invention, and that makes sense. I mean, it's actually sort of the core of what we believe. I mean, one of the things that we believe at IDEO is that core to the notion of innovation is also human-centeredness. Sometimes known as consumer-centeredness, but we like to think of it as human-centeredness. And the reality around that is that when you start thinking about how you're innovating and how it's really going to engage with the consumer, or you're going to engage with the people who have to work with it, you actually get, I think, change for the good. I think healthcare is a great example. One of the major shifts that I've seen in the work that we've done over the last kind of 10 years is this shift in healthcare to the notion of patient-centeredness. It really didn't exist in the same way it does, but it's actually been a pretty fierce driver for innovation in the realm of healthcare, and a lot of that's focused around the idea of suddenly saying, well, wait a second, the patient's a consumer, and if we want to actually keep our consumer secure and happy, we have to think about that. So I think maybe it's important for us to expand the notion of innovation to not just be around kind of technology and invention, but also around the ways these things are impacting the people for whom they come in contact with.
I think the challenge in part is, what is the purpose of business, capitalism, innovation, and what is the filter by which you go back and reflect how effective you've been? And to me, a challenge is that often business is set out to achieve the wrong purpose. So, what purpose is Johnson & Johnson fulfilling when they let so many people go? They've fulfilled a short-term financial.
Well, but they're also in all of our mutual funds, for instance, and so you can vote. I didn't mean to interrupt you that much, but
but that's a good example. I mean, are they? There's so many different parts of the system, but you mentioned mutual funds. So, do the companies? I mean, you look at the labor movement. And you look at where the labor movement has its money invested in all of the same companies and through pension funds everybody else does. And yet, in many cases, those companies are fighting with labor. I mean, you have all of these weird systems collisions. So labor gives money to a mutual fund that invests in a business that then is fighting to reduce the benefits that they provide to labor. Phil Angeles, people know Phil Angeles, he was the treasurer of CalPERS. CalPERS is a $250 billion fund, and he told a wonderful story, and this was 10 years ago. He said, I feel bad when I invest in the pharmaceutical industry because I make great returns. You know, I invest $1, I get $2 back, so that's a good thing. But when I started to look at this from a systemic perspective, what I realized is I invest $1, I get another $1 back, so I've made a good return. The people who I'm investing the money for end up paying $4 for the increased cost of the drugs they're buying. So I've made a profit on the investment in their portfolio, but they are poorer for it because in order for me to make that profit, and I don't know whether people are following me, you end up paying twice as much through the drugs that you buy. And to me, it goes back to this systemic question, which is how wide a lens do we look at the effects and the unintended consequences of what we're doing? And I think that if we look widely enough, we make better decisions. And because we're in this global, interconnected world, we have to look much wider than we've ever looked before. And I think that if you look widely, you'll make better decisions for people. And I think we've been able to survive in this highly compartmentalized world where it works here. And who cares about what happens outside of the very narrow focus in which we live. And so innovation to me is as much about ways we think and the way we design our business and the systems that we use to run our business. And I think that we need as much innovation in structure and thought and consciousness as we do in technology.
I think you're right, and I think what's really interesting to me is, and you hear it, and we've even heard it over the last kind of 12 hours or so, which is that there's this kind of general sense that the crisis has ended or it's ending, and it's certainly kind of like a common theme that we're seeing. And one of the things that I have to keep reminding myself is that it's like one crisis may be ending. In fact, I think what's really pivotal about this moment is that we're seeing many, many things coming to a head that are actually, you could argue, crises. So a crisis of environment and the ways that we're having impact, a crisis of healthcare and making sure that we have kind of the impact that we need to there. And I think that we may lose the opportunity of the urgency that we put beyond to think about that bigger system if we say, oh, it's over.
I worry about that.
Right, because what we've done is said, oh, well, the crisis was a financial crisis. The crisis wasn't. It was one of many things that came together to make the moment we have now that we need to take advantage of. I absolutely agree with you on that. So.
One of the things, just to shift gears just a bit is, we keep talking about how to help business either through the government or some other system to again, to use the frame, to harness innovation in all its forms, whether it's technological or innovation in our perspective. But at the same time, we also see that, and I hate to use the word society, but those of us who are living in the modern world have literally changed the way we think about the products we use or the way we interact with business, so that a business like yours might not have done well 30 years ago. People would not have spent more money for a product that was environmentally super friendly because, one, there was not a consciousness that it would want something to do. I mean, my experience as a journalist is that most people, even people who are economically in a difficult position, want to be empowered, want to have really enjoy and appreciate the ability to take part in some sort of larger scheme around them. And so buying an environmentally friendly product, or perhaps even participating in the economic costs of cap and trade. In other words, paying higher prices for fuel. If I felt I was paying a higher price just to help ExxonMobil or the local fuel producer, I might not be as inclined if I thought it was helping the globe. And we've seen that change. And not to go on too long, but one of the more popular TV shows now is one that allows us to look back into the 1950s and watch the way consumers were encouraged to buy certain products. This is the show Mad Men. And one of the great ads, because I actually have an ad that I collected many years ago, was the cigarette ad, which said, you know, I forget what it was. It could have been Camels. And underneath it, it said, "It's toasted." And you know, there were other ads then with, you know, doctors saying, you know, cigarettes are good for you. And it turns out there are good things about cigarettes. It makes you think certain ways, whatever. But the entire way people are thinking is changing. So before we think about what government can do, I mean, are there ways in which it's just happening that we should just let evolve, you know, and wait until a more human reaction, which is we have disasters and then we just respond to disasters?
I mean, I think it's actually really interesting, and one of the things that we know is that we're living with a tremendous complexity of information at any given moment. I mean, we know a lot more about all sides of the situation, which frankly I think we can argue is not the case. It wasn't the case, certainly wasn't the case in Mad Men era. It wasn't even necessarily the case 10 years ago. It's like we just know a lot more. And it means that I think we are going to weigh our decisions much more carefully, specifically when we're thinking about consumer choices. But I actually also think it's going to have other impacts, which is that I think that if we think about the reasons that we all do the work that we do in this room, nobody's going out there saying, well, maybe, but no one's out there being like, I want to be mean to the world today. You know, everyone's basically saying there's some real reason why I want to do this that actually is impacting the way I'm thinking about the ways I'm participating in the companies I work with. I mean, presumably something in your nature wants you to kind of follow truth, right? I mean, that's got to be somewhere down there.
Maybe.
Yeah, maybe. It's like, yeah, well, way back there, but it's there, and I think that's I think that's the case for actually all of us. And I think that one of the things that we're seeing is the ability to wake up the notion that we're far more complex, and that the idea that we're just working for a company doesn't necessarily make sense. We have to work for a company that has some kind of connection with the ethics that we hold. And again, to go back to like the healthcare conversation, I think it's just interesting because, you know, you don't talk to we know that there's terrible, terrible doctors and nurses. You have terrible experiences out there. You've never once talked to a doctor or nurse who went into the business for an unethical reason. They went there because they wanted to make people healthier, right? We somehow have distanced ourselves from that. I think what we'll see in this kind of complexity and this understanding of ourselves as richer identities is greater demand for meaning in all parts, not just in the things we consume, but where we work and how we work and why we work for the places. So I think that's I'm obviously an optimist, that's an incredibly hopeful place to begin from.
There's so much more openness and transparency in how businesses are conducted, just really in the last 5 years. Whether it's with our employees, whether it's with our customers, our partners, the NGOs, the consumer organizations, we get input, we get feedback, you know, at a volume that certainly was not the case just a few years ago. And we have to respond to that. Certainly, you know, brands that are very well known must respond to the various stakeholders that they get input from. And it does impact what we do. We just launched Windows 7, and there's a significant focus in Windows 7 on energy efficiency. It makes economic and business sense to do that. But we got huge feedback from our customers. And we knew that it's not just the software, it's also the hardware and the other components and devices. And so we spent the last few years talking to our ecosystem of hardware partners and how together we could drive greater energy efficiency, you know, throughout the computer ecosystem.
If I can give an example from the Business and
Yeah,
Society
that'd be great.
program, which is really interesting. I mean, there's a woman, Mary Gentile, who works and creates she has a program that she calls Giving Voice to Values, and it's actually something that's actually kind of spread through pretty widely through business education right now. It's amazing how much it's been picked up. And the premise is basically teaching business students how to go forward and give voice to ethical decisions they want to make. And this is becoming a core curricula when you go forward. So it actually strikes me that what we're suggesting is that the workforce is looking for ways to argue for ethical value in the things that you're doing within the corporate context. That's very exciting. And those kinds of things, I think, give me quite a bit of hope around the notion that we will see move from within markets and industries.
There's no question that the business case for being responsible and ethical is stronger than it's ever been. And I think I would say that companies that aren't focused on this strategically will be losers in the future. So, I mean, our business grew 50% last year. It grew because we're offering something that consumers want. We don't even really spend money advertising. I still think, though, we need to balance this positive momentum that is a search for new meaning and values and wanting to be part of something good with the systemic restraints that we face. Because, and I'll be personal, the seventh generation. You know, we sell healthier, safer products to people that have money and education and can afford to buy them. And we don't reach the people that need our products the most, which are lower income people. And there is a collision of values. You know, I want to make the world a better place, but I'm making the world a better place mostly for the people for whom the world is already a better place. Why is that? You know, why is that? Well, in part, it's because, you know, it goes back to the argument last night, which touched on this, about externalized costs. Well, I think that, you know, organic food should cost half the price of traditional food. If you had to pay to clean up the groundwater from pesticides, or you had to pay to clean up the health effect of workers that are exposed to pesticides, traditional food would cost a lot of money. But we have, you know, the challenge is we have all this goodwill and this momentum and this desire to do all this good stuff with a system that isn't yet designed to capture all of that potential. And I think that the time has come where we got to face some of these fundamental systemic problems. Why does good stuff cost more than bad stuff? You know, my calculations are off, but if you paid the full cost of the environmental effect of a Hummer, it should cost about $1 million to $2 million. You know, but it doesn't. And you can drive the Hummer and you can make the Hummer. Well, maybe they won't be making any more Hummers in the future, but to me, this is a problem. And so we live at this fascinating inflection point of this huge potential momentum and this business case that argues for doing the right thing. But there's some restraints that we have to deal with. And those restraints are around capturing some of these externalities. And, you know, we've got the restraints about money and politics. I mean, that's you know, this political system is a difficult one to navigate because it's sort of a checkbook, you know, politics still. So you know, to me, it's like the most fascinating thing that I think about is how do we get from here to a system that encourages the outcomes that we all want? Because we all want the same outcomes. How do we create a system that is designed to maximize the ability of businesses and individuals to have all of these positive outcomes? I mean, you know, just say one last thing. I mean, you know, I was meeting with Carol Browner a couple of weeks ago, and I said to her, why is it that this wonderful administration is spending $1 billion to reduce the cost of virgin fiber and make recycled fiber artificially look more expensive? It's a case, it's a fact, that's what the government spends building roads and providing discounts to forest companies that want to cut down timber. So artificially recycled fiber, which everyone says they want, costs more money. And she said, hey, you know, it's difficult to undo those regulations that were put in place before. Well, we've got thousands and thousands of regulations like that that are doing the wrong things. And anyone who tells you they want government out of business is smoking something powerful, because government is so involved in business. In almost every single thing that business does, government has a hand. And when someone tells you, oh, no, you know, that's too much government involvement, it's not too much government involvement, it's the wrong kind. They don't want that type of government involvement. They want the kind of government involvement that they've had in the past. So, sorry.
Jeff, with that, and that was a terrific sort of summary of some of the issues before us. There are some people in the audience who have expressed an interest in asking the panel or raising some questions. So I'd like to open it up and come back. I have some other questions right here.
Hi, I'm Charlotte Frank, and I'm with the Just a moment.
1 second, we're going to.
Stand up, but I'll give you my cafeteria voice.
No, no, we have a microphone. We have a microphone for you.
All right, can you hear me now? All right? This has something to do with, this is an interesting experience for me, because I'm going to talk about Business Week here at Bloomberg. But you've been talking about effectiveness, results, driving force, and profits and purpose. Can capitalism, fuel the future? This has to do a little bit with character, values, but we don't use that word now because people don't know. Your value is not my value, and so the whole thing has to do with character education. Business Week, I came to, obviously you can tell by my cafeteria voice, I came to McGraw-Hill Business Week from the New York City schools. At any rate, Business Week was doing something called an advertorial. I had no idea what that word was, and then considering I was the head of curriculum instruction, all right, that's a special advertising section. But they wanted, this is a business, they had to make money. But they wanted to do something in education. So we had 10 years of awards to, talking about what was important in education, different themes each year. The issue had to do with identifying schools that had the best practices and giving them awards, because that's what the advertisers wanted. They wanted to know how they were going to get, what was the return for them to invest in this special advertising section. So we designed this piece. One of the pieces was schools of character. I mean, there are stories about each one, and I have research on each one of them. The schools of character started that was done probably about 9 years ago. And who started it? Because there was somebody called Sandy McDonald, then of McDonnell Douglas, who wanted to do, and started in St. Louis, character education, respect, responsibility, feeling for one for another, all of that. I can only tell you the legacy of that is they have continued to do the Schools of Character publications for 10 years, and this past weekend, they had a giant conference in Washington, D.C., disseminating these effective practices. So it isn't an either or. The business can make money, and it can serve that purpose. I mean, there are stories, for anybody who's interested, I got my PhD from NYU based on the 10 years of this research. But you're asking me, and I should ask a question. I'm sorry.
If you've got one, I think what you added to the conversation was helpful in itself, because we could sort of turn the conversation again to we could probably find stories like this. We can. Mm-hmm. We can find stories like this throughout the United States and Europe and Asia. The question is how do we harness more of that so that it's not just anecdotes, but in fact some sort of larger ethos. I mean, to go back to what Jeff is saying, he is really saying that there needs to be a change in the way government plays a role here. I mean, you can't do it without that kind of a change.
Well, I was actually going to respond to that and saying that, businesses do have a role to play in changing systemic challenges that generally impact their business. Just following on what you said, we have a crisis in this country where we don't have enough children studying science, technology, engineering, and math, the STEM disciplines. And this has an impact on Microsoft because we want to hire people that are proficient in these disciplines. We want to hire master's and PhD degreed persons who can go into our business, who can go into our customers, our partners' business. We need people that have these disciplines to help drive the innovation and the deployment and use of technology across the economy. But we don't have our young people going into these disciplines. So as a company, we understand we have a responsibility to work across the education system, beginning in K through 12, up into higher education, to ensure that our educational system is more focused on this space. We know that middle school math, algebra, is the gateway to higher math. And if you don't go to higher math, you're not going to go into these STEM disciplines. So as a company, we're incredibly focused on ensuring all along the pipeline of talent that there is much more focus and more resources and tools applied to getting young people into the STEM disciplines. We also know that today we don't have enough people, enough Americans graduating from our universities with these disciplines. We know that our computer science departments across the country are not attracting enough Americans, and so they're actually filled, about 50% of the seats are filled by foreign nationals. And then you get into this whole issue about high-skilled immigration and visas. And we understand as a company, we've got to play a role in creating the systemic change so that we do have a pipeline of talent for the Americans, but also that our schools and our universities, which are the best in the world, are attracting the best talent from the world. So we understand we've got a role to play, both in working with educational institutions and working on public policy issues with government. So it's a whole set of issues that are directly ultimately in our benefit, but have much significant societal impact.
One thing that I actually
suggest that you contact Bob Moses, Project Algebra, if you want to do something, especially for the lower performing schools, all of that. Middle school, dynamite, good research.
One of the things, though, I will add on to that, though, is that I think those are great examples, and we need really compelling examples of unique and schools that kind of stand out in kind of delivering what they do. I think it does go back to the main question, which is that can you innovate at that level if the platform itself may well be wrong? And I think education is one of those places where I actually do wonder whether or not we have a platform that allows for the appropriate kind of innovations to take hold. And so whereas you can have very phenomenal individual moments, we still might have issues there. And I think there was a great article in the New York Times about, and I don't know the name of the school that basically it's serving breakfast from or lunch from 9 in the morning all the way till 3, just because they're trying to kind of accommodate the amount of students who are coming through. Right, and what it highlights, though, is that one of the big issues right now for education in this case is distribution. Are we getting adequate and distribution to the right people? And that's actually a place where I think we have to start to say, well, how can innovation help us there? Eric last night talked about the idea of how is technology revolutionizing the way that we actually think about education? Have we really given thought to how that might shift the way we actually are distributing education? Not really. We're still working on an old platform, doing interesting and courageous things. But I think in this case, the platform may well have to shift.
Well, the platform, and let's not forget that we live in a society where some of the most valuable and important jobs are the lowest paying ones. We pay nurses, we pay teachers. That's not where money goes. Rianne Eisler wrote a wonderful book about the caring economy, and that's a structural problem. I would be remiss if I also didn't mention that if we spent a little bit less money on the military and a little bit more money on education. But we have to, these issues have to be on the table. What is the benefit to society of more money going into education versus more money going into the military? And I think you can make a very compelling argument that your business would be better off, many businesses would be better off, if we invested more in education than we do. But there are political reasons why we don't.
Right. I'd like to open it up to the audience a bit. Over there. Sorry.
Hi, my name is Sam Simon. I'm with a nonprofit called Intersections, and I have a project called Power and Values. I appreciate the conference and the panel. I would like to ask, though, I think we're avoiding some dilemmas. Microsoft, and I appreciate the platform for innovation, yet there's a debate about open standards. But in particular, the idea that businesses can make value-based decisions absent systemic change. And I'll just throw out an example, something I tried to do many years ago and failed, was to try to get a major grocery chain to decide not to sell cigarettes. They're basically selling products that kill their customers. And the answer that I got back, and I got it up to the management level, was that if it's illegal, we will not substitute our judgment for our customers. We'll put it under lock and key and hide it, which they, of course, did not, in fact. But what about companies making judgments to on either an ethical or value base to sell or not sell products that are detrimental to the public.
Yeah. First of all, that's happening in the most unlikely of places. I mean, I spent most of my career ranting about Walmart and what a terrible company they were, and we refused to do business with Walmart. We wouldn't sell them our products for many, many, many years. Walmart today is actually making decisions. They said to their suppliers, you can't use these chemicals in the products that we sell in our store. And they're forcing manufacturers to remove dangerous chemicals from the products that they're selling. So I'm optimistic that business can make these decisions. The challenge I find is that right now, Walmart is probably a quicker and more effective way to cause change in business than the government is. Walmart has sort of become the de facto regulator of consumer products companies because they can tell any of these companies, do this and don't do this. And I think that they believe that if they don't take a more responsible, ethical stance, the future of their business will be compromised. They won't be able to open stores in new communities. They won't be able to attract a more middle and upper class consumer who is not aligned with their values. So again, this is a hopeful message, but it's not a systemic solution.
But what is the engine that makes Walmart respond to that? It's,
Well, I mean, it's a combination of their long-term business interest. So I think they believe, and I have had many conversations with Lee Scott, who was the former CEO of Walmart. When I first met him 4 or 5 years ago, he basically thought that he could just put up a wall and all of the stuff that was flying at him would go away. And he finally realized that there's a business case for him to be more responsible, more ethical, and more sustainable. Now, he's got a long way to go, but at the end of the day, if you can show a business why it is in their own best interest to do something, and they're willing to look out far enough in the future, they'll make better decisions. The challenge is that we have this whole world that's been incentivized to make very, very short-term decisions, where shareholders own stock sometimes for a matter of seconds. What kind of relationship can you have with your shareholders if they hold the stock for a couple of seconds?
Yeah. Over here.
My name is Andrew Klaber. I'm a JD MBA student at Harvard and was allowed to be here today on scholarship by the Aspen Institute. My question is for Jeff. Jeff, you spoke about systemic change that will allow capitalism to thrive in the future. As I understand it, Seventh Generation is a B corporation, which, as I understand, is a new corporate form that forces or enables a company to have certain social and environmental practices, is gunning for a new corporate tax regime, and also if a company is sold, the fiduciary duty to maximize shareholder value wouldn't just run to the shareholders, but would run toward all the stakeholders. Could you just describe what a B corporation is, why you made that decision, and how that could be a systemic change?
Yeah. Well, it goes to this question of structural and institutional change to support the kind of world we want to live in. So B Corp requires you to change your bylaws so that your directors make decisions for the best interest of all stakeholders. And stakeholders are defined as the environment, the community, so that our bylaws now proactively insist that when our board makes a decision, they consider all stakeholders, which means it would be challenging. I mean, this is a tough economy. We could have done what lots of people did and fire some people to improve our financial performance, but it would not be aligned with the purpose of the company and the way our board has to function. So our board made a decision that we were going to tolerate lower profits for the next 2 to 3 years until the economy improved so that we didn't have to lay anybody off. Now, that's doable when you have investors who were invested for 10, 20, 30 years. It's not tolerable when you have an investor who's in the stock for a week. But B Corp is a very, very important structural change to a corporate charter and bylaws that institutionalizes, I think, better behavior. And we'd invite all of you to join.
It's a message to take back to Microsoft.
Hard for a public company to do.
Yes.
It is hard for a public company to do, but I think companies do it in different ways. We have actually increased the amount of money we're spending in R&D this year to $9.5 billion, more than last year, even in these very challenging times. Because as a company, we have a history of investing for the long term. And that's who we are, that's what we do, and shareholders have internalized that over time. That's important to our employees. It's very important to our partners who are critical to the overall health of our business ecosystem. So I think companies do it in a variety of different ways. Again, what is core to who they are, what their values are.
Yeah, I actually would also add that it's like, I think that there's iconic moments of impact. I think what you're talking about is a great example where it's like you can hold it up as a great icon. And then there's also ways of thinking about impact at scale. Those things have to be balanced out as well, and we need to have multiple things happening in the ecosystem to have the impact that we want to have. I don't think there can be one single model to do it. And so it's a great model, but I think, it's very interesting to watch Walmart right now. Very interesting to sort of see the kinds of impact they're having at scale. Likewise, there's things that they can do that's going to be profound to see, I think, because of the different model, I think. So.
It's this weird balancing act of do all the good things you can do, but don't forget that we need to make some systemic changes so that everybody else is encouraged to do those things also.
Yes.
Hi, I'm Casey Jennings. I just wanted to follow up, Jeff. Who polices the B Corp? I mean, what if you decided differently? Who tells you that that doesn't follow your mandate or your goals?
There is little policing, and it is a great idea that has yet to prove its effectiveness in the marketplace. So we don't have a case where a B Corp made a decision and someone challenged that decision. And it is endemic to this whole world of corporate responsibility where I always say, now you are all the CEOs of the Fortune 500. And I'm going to ask you a question. Are you running a sustainable, responsible company? Well, how many hands would go up? Every hand in the room. Because we, unfortunately, can make the determination ourselves that we're responsible and we're sustainable and we're doing the right thing. And we need better tools and guidelines and metrics. One of the best things, because just to be positive, how many people have the good guide on their PDA? 1, 2, 3. The good guide is the best way to help you make decisions about what products to buy. You can go into a grocery store, take a picture of the barcode. Within a second, you'll get a rating of that product and company based on about 11,000 different pieces of information. Fantastic tool to encourage decisions that are aligned with your values. And soon, in a couple of months, you'll be able to say, well, I really care about women's issues, and I really care about environmental issues, so I want you to customize the rating to my own personal concerns. And they'll be able to do that. So, this is, I'm sure you know them well because they're based in San Francisco. There are some wonderful things like Good Guide and B Corp that are arising to help us as a society make better decisions. I don't think they rate software yet.
Yeah, question over here.
Hi, Steve Killaway, Institute for Economics and Peace. It strikes me that you can't actually understand the role of capitalism in society until we actually understand how do we actually measure progress. So today, if we look, the major measurement of progress is GDP. So there's projects with the OECD, World Economic Forum and such to actually redefine how we measure progress. But unless we can do that, how do we actually understand the role of capitalism within society? So if you look at the American Constitution, it's almost like it's been rewritten to life, liberty and the pursuit of products rather than happiness. Would the panel like to comment on that?
Well, actually, I think you're absolutely right. I think that we actually need to be looking at new metrics and new modes of evaluation as well. Actually, one of the projects we're actually doing right now with Good is actually looking at how to evaluate, how do you actually, what are the new modes and methods that you might use, because they actually may not, the old ones don't necessarily apply, especially when you're kind of trying to look here. So I think there's interesting experimentation around that. It sounds like what you're doing, if I understand it, the Peace Index is a great example of that. So, and I actually suspect there's other people in the room who are doing things a lot like that. So I think we're seeing an emergent system of metrics that are going to be incredibly valuable for, again, giving the consumer or humans, the perspective they need to make the decisions that are actually going to drive business decisions in the long run too. So I think it's a great cycle.
Look at what France just did. I mean, France, people aware of the project in France that is changing the way GDP is calculated to be a more indicative sign of progress and well-being. Sarah right here is running an organization that is bringing together, Sarah, raise your hand, that is bringing together all kinds of business and economic and labor groups to try to think collaboratively about new metrics and new systems that will help us. Because if we don't have measurement, who is to say that we're really making progress? And so that's a big gap. There's measurements that tell us we're making progress when we're absolutely heading in the wrong direction. And that's a problem.
Yes, Abhi.
Good morning. Thanks a lot for the panel. It's been great. My name is Terry Ludwig, and I help lead an organization called Enterprise. And Enterprise is a social enterprise, and at the nexus of, it's technically a nonprofit, but it has a for-profit arm, a nonprofit arm, and then policy. And just as way of example, I'd like to go back to the externality sort of question, because I think the systematic change is absolutely right on point, and I'd like to think about what we can do to kind of push some of that thinking forward. Enterprise, it's a developer of affordable housing, community development. It does this through different mechanisms, but effectively our client base is the bottom of the pyramid. So we're working with low-income people throughout the country to make sure that everyone has safe, affordable housing, and it's connecting to resources and bringing resources to communities. So just to give an example of some of the type of work we're doing and why I think it's so important to capture the externalities, a week ago we announced a commitment to build green, affordable housing. And what that commitment looked like, in short, was to bring $4 billion worth of financing to the table, number one. Number two, to put a stake in the ground and say, we will not finance any more affordable housing unless it is green. And so we put that stake in the ground, and we're basically trying to do the financing, the policy, trying to get a lot of the externalities embedded in policy. But just to give an example to the audience of a positive externality, by having green affordable housing, you can actually not only buy a 1 to 2% investment up front that pays back in economic terms in about 2 years' time, you also have incredible health and education benefits. So for example, on the health, 1 in 4, approximately from the studies we've just done and the data we've collected, 1 in 4 visits to the emergency room in low-income communities has to do with asthma. And if you build green in affordable housing, you can reduce the incidence of asthma by 60%, 60. So we put a stake in the ground and said, for this reason, we will only commit our capital and our ideas, and we will push forward on policy ideas. So, you know, with Secretary Donovan at HUD, with Department of Energy, we've made great progress in embedding this within governmental entities to move forward. But I think the negative externalities are so important that we get that equation right, but also the positive externalities. You have this debate going on about health care. You know, where does that fit in? How can we bring that to the forefront?
Thank you. I have one more question here, and then I think we're going to wrap up the conversation. Maybe everyone here will have another comment.
Yeah, my name is Gerard Farais, and first I'd like to make a disclaimer. I love technology and I love innovation. But my question is this. I'm trying to reconcile the issue of innovation and the resultant obsolescence with the issue of consumption and increased consumption and the environmental impact. So how do you create a balance between continual innovation, which we need, but yet at the same time causes a new iPod to be bought every 3 months maybe, and results in tremendous amount of obsolescence, which has huge impacts?
You want to take it on first?
Well, I'm going to sound like I give the same answer to everything, but if we had an economic system that paid some of the costs of disposal for those products that are obsolete. So when you purchase the product, and this is true in some parts of the world, you had to pay to disassemble it and recycle it. You might not be buying them so often. And the companies that were designing the products might design them to last a little bit longer. But, you know, when I look at things that don't work the way we want them to, I usually think, well, why is that? Have we not designed something that encourages that behavior by business and consumers? I think the tougher question is the discomfort we have with the whole notion of just buying less stuff. I mean, I often tell the story that I keep getting inspired to commit myself to go for a month without buying anything new. Well, in the first month, you know, the new iPhone was coming out, and I said, okay, well, I'm going to start next month after I get my iPhone. But then the MacBook Air came out, and I said, well, okay, I'm going to put it off another month. And we are almost obsessed with this notion of consumption, and it becomes part of our identity and who we are. And you know, I can't blame that on Apple. You know, that's about me, and that's about who I am and what fulfills me and what makes me happy and my own identity. And I guess my concluding thought is, at the end of the day, we got to look at ourselves, and we have to look at the role that we play in all of this, and the role that and how we contribute to all the things we don't like in the world, because at least for me, most of the problems start right here. And before I look outside and point my finger at anybody else, I want to make sure that I've looked deeply inside myself to see how I get up every day and contribute to creating all the things in the world that I don't like. And I usually find that I am part of the problem, not just part of the solution, as I like to think that I am.
Well, we could end it with that, unless Pam or Fred, you want to?
No, I would just say, you know, in terms of a corporation, it's very similar. I mean, you have to think about your own ecosystem, your own networks, and where you can have the biggest impact. That's really core to what you can do best. And recognizing that you will get a lot of input from the various stakeholders we've talked about. But fundamentally, you have to do what you have within your greatest ability to do. And I think Walmart, as we've talked about, is a great example of it is using its supply network. We use our ecosystem. And they have to be win-win ecosystems across the board. Everybody has to be able to succeed in them. And you know, when there is a player in the ecosystem that does not succeed, then the ecosystem dies.
Well, I just might add to that. I mean, I actually think it's an interesting thing. It's an interesting thing to come here where the topic of the program is future of capitalism and realize that we'll get to the future. It'll be 10 years, and we won't realize it's the future, right? We'll be in it. It's like so, and the point here, I think, is that it's like really now is as much the future as anything. It's the decisions we're making to impact the ecosystems and think about the ways that we're actually behaving in business and in action are in fact the future happening. And so I think it's really critical that we take this moment to reflect on that and take that forward.
Well, you know, one of the things that, you know, I wanted to get into and discuss, I know there are other people in the audience that have their own ideas, and it's very exciting that this conversation alone happens, and I think we should thank you, Walter, and the Aspen Institute for really encouraging a sort of a mini Davos here in New York for those of us who can't make it over there and may not even want to go. Yeah. But, you know, my interest, of course, has always been in the media, and that is another pillar of society. I'm not so sure that Walmart would have done the many things it has done without the force. And when we talk about the media, we discuss something that's been referred to as the mainstream media, which I've always been in, as well as the other one that's more internet or open or community-based. But I would want to make a pitch for the fact that unless we have a very strong so-called mainstream media that can do the kind of so-called investigative or in-depth kind of journalism, those of us who say, well, we're changing the way we look at the world, wouldn't know how the world works. And so that's one last pitch I'd like to make. One model that has grown up very recently is a nonprofit based sort of solution. There's a group called ProPublica that does terrific investigative work that is turning up in community newspapers around the country that would never publish those kinds of things. There's my daughter, who's trying to break into journalism, works for a nonprofit monthly newspaper in the Bronx that was created by Montefiore Hospital. There's now a series of community newspapers there for communities that would not have had newspapers. So those of us here who have the ways and means might want to think about supporting the media. In all of its warts, it continues to be the major force for allowing the rest of us, all of us, to really see inside of corporate America as well as government. So with that, I'd like to thank you all. I'm hoping that you have a terrific rest of the day. I want to thank the panel.